Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at your AQA AS Sociology paper 1, the paper that we've written for 2024. Now, what I want you to pay attention to in this paper is how we've structured our answers. Gemma is an expert examiner, so she really knows what sort of things she as an examiner would be looking for in an A-style answer.
Level Sociology AQA Paper 1 Education with Methods in Context Predicted Paper 2024. You have 1 hour and 30 minutes allowed to complete all questions on this paper, and there are no choices when it comes to those questions. You do have to answer all questions from both sections of the paper. The first section of the paper is relating to knowledge from the education topic, and within that section you have a variety of questions from the lowest tariff Sociology AS questions at 2 marks up to the highest tariff AS Sociology question at 20 marks. As a general guide, you should spend 1 hour on the education section of the paper and 30 minutes on the methods in context section of the paper. As usual, in AQA Sociology, you should be allowing 15 minutes to complete every 10 marks available. And the shorter questions at 2 and 6 marks should be answered in bullet point form, whereas you will be writing in paragraphs and essays for the 10 and 20 markers. And a final reminder that the second section of this paper, the methods in context section, is where you will be tested on both your research methods knowledge and your knowledge of education. Here you will be given a specific research method and you will be asked about the advantages and disadvantages of using that research method within a specific context of education that you have learned. So the purpose of this predicted paper walkthrough is to go through all of those predicted questions for 2024, ensuring you understand what the question is asking and how you should structure your answer. We'll also be having a look at what the examiners are looking for on the mark scheme, and then finally going through some top band model answers. So let's get going. Section A, Education. Define the term meritocracy, 2 marks. So this first question on the exam will always ask you to define a key term on the specification. So it really is best practice when you are revising to go through each of the topics that you have learnt within education and pull out around about 10 to 15 key concepts that you can focus on providing a definition of. And when it comes to gaining the 2 marks, the examiner really is just looking for 2 pieces of knowledge. You are only being assessed on AO1 here, so you just need to ensure you define the key term sociologically and add a bit of supporting detail. That supporting detail might be in the form of an example, or it might be a sociologist associated with that key concept, or it could even be the theoretical perspective that supports that key concept. And whilst meritocracy has been a very fashionable term within education for 20 to 30 years, particularly since marketisation policy, if we want to discuss it from a more sociological angle, then we probably are going to refer to either functionalism or Parsons. And it's this idea that society provides jobs and pay based on an individual's talent and achievements rather than their social status. Quite often within our education study, we have been questioning whether meritocracy really does exist, and certainly many of the statistics that we consider within education regarding working class underachievement or underachievement of some ethnic groups within education, we could suggest that we don't truly have a meritocratic system. For the purpose of this question though, let's have a look at the mark scheme. And you can see that the mark scheme is really simple. It's 2 marks gained for 2 correct ideas about meritocracy. So ensure that in your very first sentence, you define clearly what meritocracy means, and then either an example or some brief supporting evidence about meritocracy, maybe relating it to a sociologist or a theory. You are certainly not going to need to write any more than 1 bullet point to answer and achieve your 2 marks. Absolutely not necessary to write in paragraph form at all. And you can see some ideas there, such as achievements based on ability or talent, fairness, rewards based on effort, or a system that encourages competition or equality of opportunity, linking meritocracy to those social policy ideas of marketisation. You can also see at the bottom there, other relevant material should be credited. So as long as your answer is sociological and it is logical, then the examiner is allowed to award 1 or 2 marks. With that in mind then, let's have a look at a 2 out of 2 answer. Define the term meritocracy, 2 marks. Meritocracy refers to a fair system whereby academic or financial success is based on an individual's merits, rather than other factors such as social class background. So you can see exactly how this answer gets 2 out of 2. Initially, it refers to meritocracy as a fair system, which ensures that you can achieve 1 mark out of 2, and then supports this by arguing that a fair system means it is one that is based on an individual's merits rather than other factors such as social class background. Other pieces of supporting evidence that we could have included here include Parsons' idea about role allocation and that actually we need meritocratic education systems to ensure that students end up with the job that is most suited to their ability. Or we could have referred to the idea that marketisation policy, such as the introduction of league tables, has, according to the New Right, led to further meritocracy, whereby competition has increased. And finally, you can also see how the answer is structured in terms of just either 2 short sentences or 1 longer sentence, no need at all for a paragraph. Using 1 example, briefly explain how schools may be viewed as patriarchal institutions, 2 marks. So you would only be advised to spend a few minutes answering this question, and in that time you just need to provide 1 bullet point response. Lead with your example and then add a sentence of brief description or explanation to support your example. A hint that examples often take the form of sociological concepts that you will have learned throughout education. And we also have a key concept within this question, which is patriarchal, which refers to education systems that are dominated or controlled by men. So we are taking a feminist perspective here to argue that schools somehow are in the interests of male power. And as we know, feminism is slightly different to consider within an educational setting. And that is simply because girls are outperforming boys at almost all levels of education. So we probably are not going to be considering ways schools are patriarchal institutions with regards to educational attainment. Instead, we are going to have to try and find examples of where boys or male teachers may try to exert their power or dominance. This might include the way that girls are spoken to, the way that girls are looked at, or the way that male teachers label girls and expect them to act a certain way. So let's have a look at the mark scheme. So you can see here on the mark scheme, the examiner is able to award you 1 mark for an example that you can provide of how schools are patriarchal, and then 1 mark for some supporting evidence or explanation. And just to reiterate, you are only able to achieve a maximum of 2 marks for this answer, so there is absolutely no need to write in paragraphs. You just need to provide a bullet point response like you can see on the mark scheme here. And what you will also be able to see on the mark scheme, which is best practice for in the exam, is the example clearly stated at the start of the sentence. Here you can see examples such as the male gaze. And then after that example, you can see some supporting evidence, i.e. that male teachers and peers view girls sexually. They maybe look them up and down in their school uniform as a way to exert their dominance authority as part of the patriarchy. And finally, what you can also see at the bottom of that mark scheme is a sentence saying other relevant material should be credited. So within the AQA, A-level and AS sociology exams, examiners are advised to accept any logical arguments that are sociological. So if one of your ideas is not included on here, don't worry. As long as it relates to the patriarchy, you will be credited for it. And that is a really good top tip with regards to looking in the media and through newspapers, watching the news and checking social media regularly right up until the day of your exam, because there may be government policies, there may be news reports about education that you can include in your answer. So let's have a look at a 2 out of 2 answer. Using 1 example, briefly explain how schools may be viewed as patriarchal institutions, 2 marks. Girls may experience the male gaze whilst at school. This means that girls are objectified by male peers and teachers who look them up and down in a sexual way and reinforce unequal power relationships between men and women. So you can see the structure here. We clearly state within the first sentence that we are referring to our example of the male gaze, which, just to remind you, is that theory put forward by Mack and Gale, arguing the way male pupils and teachers look girls up and down is in a way to view them as sexual objects, making judgments about their appearance and reinforcing male male-dominant identities. The 2 sentences easily give us 2 out of 2. And it's also a really good example here of just how much you are expected to write to achieve your 2 marks. There is no need to write any more than 2 sentences. Students can sometimes be tempted to define the key concepts in the question, such as patriarchal, but there really is no need and no time to do that. Outline 3 ways material factors may cause class inequalities in education. 6 marks. You're going to spend around about 8 minutes answering this question. And in terms of structure, the examiner is just looking for a bullet-pointed response. No need at all to write in continuous prose or to write a paragraph. So 3 bullet points that are separated with a line in between each one. And with regards to that structure, you just make sure at the start of each of your 3 bullet points, you very clearly identify the material factor and then go on to add 1 sentence of description or explanation, fully linking this to a reason why class inequality may occur in education. And there are 2 key parts within this question that we need to make sure we understand in order to get full marks. Firstly, material factors. So here we are discussing poor diet, poor health, or poor housing that may impact educational outcomes. And with the term class inequalities within education, we are normally referring to the fact that working class students do not perform as well as middle class students. And that can be measured in terms of outcomes such as GCSEs achieved. So the question is really asking us to consider the way that the material deprivation that some working class students may experience can be directly linked to those lower GCSE grades that they then go on to achieve. The other way we may see a question like this in the exam is if it asks us about cultural factors causing class inequalities in education. And if that question came up, we are not considering material goods that the students are lacking. We are considering appropriate norms and values that they may be lacking. Quite often in sociology, we actually do argue the material and cultural factors go hand in hand. For now though, let's focus on material factors and have a look at the mark scheme. So you can see there just generally on these 6 mark questions, the examiner is able to award you 2 marks for each of the 3 appropriate ways clearly outlined. That means for each of your 3 ways, you have provided an example of a material deprivation and then linked this to class inequality. Just be aware then that 2 marks is capped at 2 marks per bullet point. You cannot achieve more than that if you decide to write a detailed paragraph about the material deprivation that you have mentioned. And you can see there on the mark scheme exactly how you are going to achieve those 2 marks. So on the left-hand side, you have a variety of different material factors that working class students may experience. Poor diet and nutrition, poor housing, lack of educational resources, and the need to undertake employment alongside school. Identifying any of those would help you to achieve 1 mark out of 2 marks possible for each of your bullet points. And what you can see on the right hand side is the kind of detail that we need to support the example given. So with regards to poor housing, we've identified that as a material deprivation that working class students might experience. And then we've explained why this might lead to class inequalities. And that is because working class students therefore may lack a really good quiet working space to complete homework and be able to focus on that work, which gives middle class students an advantage if they do have that space in their own bedroom, if they do have a study within their house, as opposed to a working class student who might actually be sharing their bedroom with other siblings. So let's have a look at what a 6 out of 6 answer looks like. Outline 3 ways material factors may cause class inequalities in education. 6 marks. 1 way material factors cause inequalities in education is through poor housing and living conditions. This may impact poorer students negatively, as they may not have a quiet, warm study space to complete activities like homework and therefore fall behind. Another way is through poor diet and nutrition. Research suggests that there is a clear link between poor diet and lower attendance at school, which means poorer students miss out on vital learning through more frequent bouts of illness, which increases inequality. A final way is through lack of resources at home. Poorer students may be less likely to afford textbooks, laptops, or extracurricular school trips that enable learning to happen away from the classroom, meaning they fall behind middle class students who do have access to these resources. So you can see in each of those 3 bullet points, we have very clearly shown the examiner that we are including a specific example just by our first word or 2 words by 1 way another way, and a final way. We've also got a space between each of our bullet points. We then identify very clearly a material factor. We've got poor housing, we've got poor diet, and we've got lack of resources. And in each of our 3 bullet points, we've then got a sentence of sociological description, which clearly links this material factor to causing class inequality, i.e. to widening that educational gap between working class students and middle class students when it comes to examination data. And just to remind you, whenever we are considering the gap between working class and middle class students within education, we tend to rely on our either free school meals data or what is now referred to as our pupil premium data. And both of these are based on household income. And there tends to be around about a 25% gap between the number of working class or pupil premium students who are able to achieve 5 GCSE grade 9 to 4s and those that are considered middle class. I think it's also worth pointing out within this answer that within each of the bullet points we very clearly state why this is going to disadvantage the working class or why this is going to prove an advantage for the middle class. So in that first bullet point, we mention this may impact poorer students negatively. So we are showing the examiner that we are making that link between the poor housing and poorer students being worse off. In the middle bullet point, we talk about poor diet and lower attendance, meaning poor students miss out on vital learning. Again, we are showing how this is going to increase inequality between the working class and the middle class. And finally, in that last bullet point, we talk about middle class students who do have access to these resources, which gives them a head start against poorer students. And by stating that example really clearly, supporting it with some sociological description that makes a link between material factors and class inequalities, we easily get our 6 out of 6. Outline and explain 2 reasons for ethnic differences in education, 10 marks. A reminder, you should allocate 15 minutes to complete this question in the exam. And as this is an outline and explain question, you need to provide 2 paragraphs with a line between both of them to show the examiner that you have 2 very separate reasons. I would recommend using the PEEL, point, evidence, explain, link approach to answering this question in both of your paragraphs, which means you are able to hit all the criteria on the mark scheme. And with regards to the content within this question, ethnic differences in education are a very varied picture. Whereas when it comes to class differences or when it comes to gender differences, we can very quickly and very easily say there is one group outperforming another, i.e. the middle class outperforming the working class or girls outperforming boys. The ethnic differences are much more complicated. So we absolutely do have some ethnic groups within the UK who repeatedly and consistently underperform in exams. Tends to be Black, Caribbean and white children, particularly working class white boys. The picture for other ethnic groups is much more positive. So for example, Indian children and Chinese children consistently overperform within exams. So within this question, you've got to decide very quickly, are you going to focus on 2 reasons why some ethnic groups underperform? Or are you going to decide to base your 2 points on 2 reasons why some ethnic groups overperform within education? Either approach is fine, as is taking one overperforming group and one underperforming group. And when you've made that decision, you then need to decide, are you going to focus on internal factors that may lead to ethnic differences in education? So something like teacher labelling, for example, of certain groups, potentially institutional racism within schools that students may experience? Or are you going to focus more on external factors that may lead to ethnic differences? Potentially you could look at material factors, such as some ethnic groups being more prone to poverty. Maybe the students have a lack of resources at home. Or are you going to focus on potentially some cultural differences between ethnic groups? Perhaps Indian families, for example, are more likely to live in extended family environments, and there is support from multi-generations within that family when it comes to completing homework. So there's lots of different ways you can approach this question. You just need to decide in the exam which are the 2 reasons that I am most confident adding lots of lovely sociological explanation. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the mark scheme. So you can see on the 8 to 10 mark level descriptors there, 2 ways clearly explained to suggest reasons for ethnic differences with good knowledge in both points. So that is 2 full paragraphs with a line in between each of them. And good knowledge in sociology in both of your paragraphs is going to mean that you are able to apply examples as contemporary as possible, that you are using key concepts consistently. We've already discussed ideas like material deprivation or cultural deprivation, and you are able to apply sociological theory or sociologists to support your knowledge. Analysis will be detailed and developed in both points, so you are clearly able to show how one point leads to another point leads to another point. We also refer to that as creating a chain of ideas and using phrases like this means that, this leads to, this is supported by, are excellent little link phrases to show the examiner that you are able to analyse the studies or the reasons that you are suggesting for ethnic differences. And please note, there is nothing about evaluation in that top band level descriptors for 8 to 10 marks. This is an outline and explain question. So whilst the examiner may be able to credit evaluation if it is done in an analytical way, there is no requirement for you to apply any evaluation to achieve 10 out of 10. And I would really argue, with the strict time limits that you've got on these questions in the exam, not to bother if it's not on the mark scheme. Big difference between 4 to 7 marks and 8 to 10 marks then is if your knowledge in both points is either good for 8 to 10 marks or just reasonable in 4 to 7 marks, and if you are able to apply that for 2 ways, or maybe you are just able to explain 1 way in some detail. If you were really struggling for time in the exam and you had 2 ways but you were not able to explain them in enough detail, please do still apply them, do write them down, because just writing down your 2 ways with even a few sentences of description or explanation means that you can get into that 4 to 7 mark band criteria. Let's have a look at a top band example now. Outline and explain 2 reasons for ethnic differences in education, 10 marks. One reason for ethnic differences in education is due to cultural factors. This is an external factor, referring to differences in the home life students experience depending on their ethnicity. For example, Chinese and Indian students consistently outperform all other ethnic groups in educational attainment. And this may be due to high parental expectations within those cultures. This means these parents place a higher value on education, ensuring students complete all homework and instill respect towards teachers in school. Francis and Archer argue that this is particularly apparent within some Chinese households, whereby students strive to achieve excellent results due to parental pressure. This may also be evident within some Indian families, whereby the extended family structure that is more commonly found within this culture means that students have both their parents and grandparents encouraging them to work hard in school and providing support with home learning. So within those first 2 sentences, there are some very fundamentally important ideas within education that we address. First of all, we identify cultural factors. And just to give you some examples of cultural factors, we're referring to things like parental attitudes, as discussed within this paragraph. It could also be with regard to language barriers, though. And we then further define this as an external factor. And again, within education, anytime we are referring to external factors, we mean things that affect the student outside of the school building. So regardless of the teachers that student encounters throughout the day, regardless of the Ofsted rating of the school that they are attending, that student has a range of factors that already affects or impacts their learning before they even go through the front door of that school. And as discussed previously, ethnic differences within education is a very varied topic, and here we are actually discussing a way cultural factors can have a real positive effect on a student's educational outcomes. And here we have selected the 2 ethnic groups that do consistently overachieve within education. So the national average in terms of achieving 3 A's at A level sits at around about 12%. For Chinese students, that sits more at around the 20% mark. Please then note the use of this means, which signposts the examiner that we are now explaining these differences. And here we apply the argument from Francis and Archer that actually within some Chinese households, there is just a greater emphasis placed on the importance of education than in other ethnic groups. And that actually that kind of parental pressure really does have a significant impact when it comes to educational outcomes. Note we also add more explanation through that phrase. This may also be evident, which further shows the examiner we are analysing. And here we actually use some knowledge from families and households. So we know those extended family structures are much more likely and more commonly found within Indian families in the UK, potentially as a consequence of religious beliefs, but also just because of cultural traditions. And here we are arguing that actually having a variety variety of adults who are all very educationally focused on students performing within the British education system really does help students externally at home with things like their homework. Another reason for ethnic differences in education may be due to the negative teacher labelling and racism experienced by some minority groups in education that disadvantages them. For example, Black Caribbean students tend to make the lowest levels of progress in schools and are more than twice as likely to be permanently excluded, meaning they are then unable to access learning. Studies into labelling by Gilbert and Udell suggest that teachers are more likely to quickly label Black Caribbean students as underachievers, and therefore they are placed in lower teaching sets, which means they do not access the same teaching and resources as other students who are pushed to achieve the best results. This may further disadvantage this ethnic group, as they may then internalise these negative labels, and the low levels of achievement expected of them becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Before we look at the content of this paragraph, do note the way that we have structured these two paragraphs very separately to show the examiner that we absolutely are applying two separate reasons. Just those first couple of sentences at the start of both of the paragraphs, one reason for ethnic differences and another reason for ethnic differences, with a line left in between the two of them. So here we are taking a very different approach. Number one, we are arguing that it's internal factors that has a very big impact on ethnic differences in education. And secondly, we are arguing that that difference is very negative. So we're looking at the role that teacher labelling and institutional racism within education may actually disadvantage Black Caribbean students. And there's two pieces of evidence to support the idea that racism may exist within schools. We've got one here with regards to Black Caribbean students being more likely to be permanently excluded. Obviously a very drastic measure that schools don't take very often, but when they do, can leave a student without education for a certain time, or can actually lead to students being placed in educational institutions where it's very difficult for them to achieve GCSE and A levels, but also the fact that when it comes to league tables and results within schools, Black Caribbean students consistently sit at the bottom, particularly boys, in terms of achieving 5 good GCSEs. And here we then apply some classic labelling theory associated with Becker and the idea that teachers may apply these negative labels to students before the student has potentially even had chance to show their ability. And once these labels are made, it's really hard to shake off and may be internalised by the student, who then starts to act accordingly with the negative label that has been applied to them. Whenever you discuss labelling, I would really recommend going through that little link of ideas from teachers labelling a student to the student then internalising these labels, to then this becoming what's known as self-fulfilling prophecy. Read item A and answer the question that follows. Item A. Education remains a key agency of secondary socialisation today, with almost all students in some form of education until they are aged 18. Sociologists such as functionalists argue that schools perform vital functions for both individuals and wider society. This includes role allocation and maintaining social solidarity. Although the New Right share some of these views, they are also critical of some recent approaches to education. Other sociologists critique schools for simply working in the interests of the elite in society. Applying material from item A and your own knowledge, evaluate the role and function of education in today's society. 20 marks. So on a 20-mark question like this, you need to allocate yourself 30 minutes to read, interpret the item, plan and write a full sociological essay. I would always recommend for students not to bother writing an introduction, or if you do, keeping it as brief as possible, because it is so hard for the examiner to award marks there. Instead, you need to focus your attention and time on writing at least 3 to 4 well-structured and detailed Peely paragraphs. Point, explain, evidence, link and evaluation, and ensuring that throughout your essay you include sociological conclusions. That is quite common in the link part of your paragraph, and also including a short conclusion at the end. With regards to the item, it should be used in this question as a stimulus. So that means you should read the item carefully and try to pull out around 2 to 3 ideas that you can directly refer to in your essay. And that way you know that you are directly answering the question, and and you know that that material will be on the mark scheme. However, you cannot simply rely on the item. As it says in the question, using item A and your own knowledge, so you must ensure to get into the top bands that you bring in either concepts, examples, ideas or theory that are not included in item A. And very often, just like within this item, there will be a little hint at the end of it about the types of theorists that have not been included, but that you can bring into your essay. Here you've got that sentence, other sociologists critique schools for simply working in the interests of the elite in society, which is the hint about the other type of perspectives that you can include. With regards to the content with this essay question then, so there's a few words in the actual question itself that you need to understand in order to plan your answer. First of all, it's that little phrase, role and function of education. So this means that we are answering a question around the purpose of education. Why do we go to school? Who benefits from it? Is it for the individual or is it for wider society? And not just that, this idea of function always is a clue in a sociological essay that we need to refer to theory. Most obviously functionalists, but also we need to think about other structural theories and what they argue is the place of education in today's society. And whenever that word function is in a question, it does not mean that we have to be positive about, in this case, the role of education in today's society. So education could be providing a number of functions that actually act negatively for the individual or for society itself. And if we have a look at the item then, you've got a sentence there that says sociologists such as functionalists argue school perform vital functions for both individuals and wider society. So in the exam, we should be highlighting a sentence like that and then thinking about all the different sociologists within functionalist theory who would agree with that we can expand upon. So you should be thinking about Durkheim, going all the way back to the organic analogy, and then including some ideas with Parsons, role allocation, and how society helps to bridge that gap between primary socialisation and secondary socialisation. You've also got reference to the new right perspective there and the fact that they are critical of some very recent approaches to education because we know their ideas are all about promoting competition and marketisation based on what they argue is meritocratic principles. And then in that last sentence, we do have a hint that other sociological perspectives disagree with these functionalist and new right perspectives about education in society as this vital agent of secondary socialisation. And here that keyword elite should be a clue to you that you should be bringing in the Marxist perspective, who although do recognise the importance of education in today's society, they do not recognise it as a positive institution, particularly for working class students who are basically taught the correct norms, values and culture of an exploitative capitalist society. And then finally, there's one more word in the question that we need to be aware of within our answer, and that is today. So you just need to make sure that you make your answer as contemporary as possible. And we can achieve that by adding some examples of very recent educational policy or any big changes that have taken place in education. An example of that might be the fact that students now have to carry on studying English and maths until they achieve that grade 4. So let's take a quick look at the mark scheme. So you can see on that first bullet point, knowledge is almost always detailed, conceptual and analytical. So there's lots of different ideas and concepts that you would be able to include in this essay. What you need to do is make sure that you select the ones that you can argue in the most detail. So that includes being able to name specific sociologists, that includes being able to apply specific examples, and that means that where you apply those concepts and examples, you are able to explain the significance of them through your analysis. Explanation and evaluation is highly relevant and developed using a number of theoretical perspectives. So you need to ensure that the knowledge that you do select really does help to answer the question about the purpose of education in today's society. What is it doing for the individual and what is it doing for wider society? And also a good range of theoretical perspectives. So ensuring that you cover at least 3 different sociological perspectives, and ideally even within one perspective such as functionalism, understanding that there are differences of opinion there. So for example, maybe referring to Durkheim and Parsons in your answer. And evaluation will be evident and clear. So you need to ensure that you avoid the juxtaposition route of evaluation, jumping from one theoretical perspective to another. And instead, if you use that Peely writing structure approach, you will have evaluation at the end of every one of your paragraphs that relate clearly to the point that you have made, reaching sociological conclusions throughout. So ensuring that in your paragraphs paragraphs, you are able to clearly state what the purpose is that education is forming, whether that is positive or whether that is negative. And if you just have a look at that example sentence, you can see clearly how we avoid juxtaposition evaluation and how we ensure our evaluation is specific. Taking a structural view, functionalists such as Durkheim acknowledge the vital and positive role played by education in maintaining value consensus across society. This is achieved through the promotion of social solidarity within schools, whereby students gain a sense of being part of something bigger than just themselves. Althusser is highly critical of this approach and views the norms, values and culture learnt within schools as that which serves to maintain the status quo of the ruling class. So we've created debate here between Durkheim and Althusser, naming specific sociologists within a theory, and we have also criticised Durkheim's approach with regards to the type of things that students are taught in education by the Marxist Althusser approach of actually arguing that this culture really is not about giving the individual a vital understanding of wider society, but it actually just maintains the status quo or keeps things the same for the ruling class. And the key difference between a 13 to 16 mark answer and a 17 to 20 mark answer is if your knowledge stays tight and accurate the whole way through your essay, if you are able to apply a good range of ideas, i.e. 3 or 4 different perspectives, or if you apply lots of detail but are only able to apply this detail to a couple of different theoretical perspectives, and if your evaluation is in most part very good and clear, but in some parts might fall back into that juxtaposition trap. So let's have a look at a top band answer. Applying material from item A and your own knowledge, evaluate the role and function of education in today's society. 20 marks. As shown in item A, functionalists argue that education remains a key agent of secondary socialisation that performs a vital function and role in today's society. Applying a structural view, Durkheim primarily views the purpose of education to reinforce social solidarity, as shown in item A. This refers to both primary and secondary schools embedding the norms and values of modern society outside of the home, whilst also encouraging members to feel part of a shared culture. For example, this may be achieved through studying the national curriculum, whereby all students are taught about British history and Christianity and may feel a sense of pride in their nation, which in turn reinforces a value consensus. However, critics argue that today's society is highly diverse, and therefore this curriculum could instead be accused of being ethnocentric and divisive. For example, postmodernists would view Christianity as a less relevant feature of a secularised society, and therefore this learning would not promote a feeling of togetherness and undermines functionalist arguments. So you can see in that first paragraph, we've got reference to the item straight away, and what we then do is support the reference with the sociologist attached to it. So we are showing the examiner that we understand Durkheim is the functionalist associated with a view that socialisation through education is absolutely vital. There's also reference there to Durkheim applying a structural view. And just to remind you, within sociology, that refers to us taking a macro approach to understanding society, therefore arguing that we are not independent actors making independent decisions. We are actually the product of the society that we live in. And within the context of this question, that is really fantastic to include because we are subtly showing the examiner that we understand Durkheim views education as one of these fundamental large social structures that help to reinforce social solidarity. And we then signpost to the examiner that we are now including analysis and explanation through the phrase this refers to. And then you can see we've got that lovely phrase this refers to, which just signposts to the examiner that we are now explaining and analysing Durkheim's theory, i.e. understanding how schools can help to promote social solidarity through embedding the norms and values of modern society. We then use an example to support that of the British national curriculum, which was introduced in 1988, many years after Durkheim was formulating his view about education. So here we are applying a contemporary example, but showing the examiner that we understand that contemporary example through the theory of Durkheim. And just to remind you with regards to the national curriculum, the whole idea behind it is that all pupils aged between 5 and 16 years get a broad and balanced curriculum, but that also includes, as suggested in this paragraph, some knowledge with reference to the UK. And then finally, we apply our evaluation. And as you can see, we have avoided juxtaposition evaluation by focusing specifically on the point that Durkheim has made about education, reinforcing social solidarity. And just to remind you, do with ethnocentric. It's the belief that your culture or your ethnic group is somehow superior or better than other cultures, and therefore that could actually, in a multicultural postmodern society, create division and conflict within schools rather than actually bringing communities together. And then what you can also see is further evaluation. So we also support that evaluation through looking at a postmodern perspective and actually say, well, yes, in a postmodern multicultural society, is it even relevant to include some of the parts of the British curriculum that we do? For example, Christianity. We live in a secularised society. Just to remind you, that means that religion has lost significance in society now, and therefore, can we really see Christian belief as a way of bringing groups of children together within schools? Moving on to the next paragraph. Functionalist Parsons also viewed the role and function of education as significant due to the way schools teach students specialist work skills that are required within the modern economy. As mentioned in item A, this role allocation means that student skills are swiftly identified and well matched to meet the demands of modern capitalism. For example, functionalists argue that specific vocational courses teach students key skills required to be a productive member of society. However, postmodernists critique this view, arguing that this does not fully prepare students for work in today's society. They argue that we now are part of a globalised workforce, and students are not fully equipped in an outdated education system to adapt to more flexible working styles, meaning that the functions of education are failing to meet the demands of the economy and suggest Parsons' ideas are outdated. So within this paragraph, we initially identify another functionalist who supports the view that education still plays a very vital role and function in today's society. As mentioned previously, if you are considering such an important structural view like functionalism in a question like the one we've got in front of us here, absolutely a great idea to include more than one specific perspective from that theory. So here we introduce Parsons' idea that actually students do gain a lot out of education and it helps to prepare them for their role when they leave education. And just to remind you in a little more detail about Parsons' theory here then of role allocation, basically arguing that students are sifted and sorted into the right roles that they will go on to perform in later life based on their skills. And remember, the thing that underpins all of this when it comes to functionalism is the view that schools are meritocratic, i.e. they are fair systems and people achieve based on their academic abilities. And here within our evaluation, note that once again we are addressing that part of the question that says in today's society. Postmodernists will always allow you to do that. And just to remind you, with regards to postmodernity, it really is a theory that is trying to critique and provide an alternative to these traditional structural theories like functionalism. So whereas functionalists take this structural view of society that we are merely actors working within a large social structure and are fairly passive to what is going on around us. For postmodernists, society is now based on risk, it's unstable, and we are able to define ourselves primarily through what we consume. So postmodernists are never going to believe that the role and function of education today is still performing the same role and function that it did 50 or 60 years ago. In fact, as shown through this evaluation, they actually argue that the workplace of people in a postmodern society has dramatically changed in the last 20 to 30 years and that actually our education system remains quite outdated. And another really good contemporary example that you could use here is how the world of work has changed for many people since COVID. So we know that many companies had to switch very quickly to remote working as soon as lockdowns were introduced, and actually many people continue to work from home in more flexible ways, but schools have not adapted to that system for the most part. So you could use that as an example in the exam of how postmodernists would critique the way that schools haven't really kept up with the world of work in a globalised economy. So let's read on, move on from functionalist perspective and have a look at some Marxism. Although Marxists share a structural view of society, they argue that education is a negative force in modern society that simply reinforces the ideology and interest of the ruling class and therefore maintains the exploitation of the working class. Althusser argued that education simply acted as an ideological state apparatus that justified the ideas of hierarchy and inequality as being inevitable. For example, students are brainwashed to accept a subordinate position within schools, which is then mirrored in their careers, whereby powerful teachers are replaced by ruling class capitalist bosses. However, feminists argue that Marxists focus too narrowly on the role that education performs in maintaining a ruling class status quo, and therefore fail to acknowledge that patriarchal inequalities are also evident within education, reinforcing unequal power relationships between genders. So in that very first sentence, we show the examiner that we have got a great breadth of understanding when it comes to sociological theory, because we identify that whilst Marxists and functionalists share the view that structural ways to view society are the correct ways, and structures such as education are really vital to understand society, actually they disagree fundamentally on whether that is positive or whether that is negative. For functionalists, as we've already discussed, it is really positive to have these large structures such as education maintaining a status quo, but for Marxists that is clearly extremely negative. And here we refer to a specific sociologist, Althusser, who argued that education performed as part of the ideological state apparatus. And just to remind you, Althusser is an extremely important Marxist sociologist writing in the 1970s and believing that education is an institution that primarily spreads ruling class ideology. That means beliefs that support the ruling class power over the working class and maintain what he describes as a false class consciousness, i.e. the working class do not understand the source of their oppression. And here we use that analogy that school life is just there really as a means of preparing you for a life of work in a capitalist factory where you will be told what to do in the same way that your teachers tell you what to do. And you don't question that power that the boss has over you because you've become willing to accept it through your school life. And then for our evaluation, we bring in another theoretical perspective, and one that is again not mentioned specifically in the item. So we are ticking that box on the mark scheme in terms of bringing in our own knowledge. And here we use the example of feminism and their view that whilst they agree schools do promote hierarchy and do promote inequality, it is between genders, it is not between social class status. Let's read on. Bowles and Gintis support this Marxist argument about the role and function of education and suggest that there is a correspondence between the values students learn at school and those needed to maintain a submissive capitalist workforce. Furthermore, Marxists argue that a significant function and role of education in today's society is to legitimise the myth of meritocracy. This means that schools reinforce the idea that success is achieved based on hard work, when in fact Marxists argue success is based more on social class and upbringing. However, the New Right perspective heavily criticises this view by suggesting that government policies such as the marketisation of education have made schools fairer, more meritocratic and better equipped to meet the demands of a capitalist economy, which Marxists fail to acknowledge. So here we bring in another Marxist perspective, Bowles and Gintis, which supports Althusser's view that actually there is a correspondence between the values students learn at school and those needed within a capitalist workforce, and that actually in many ways education just mirrors the workplace. And there's lots of examples we can find within education to support that idea. So it may be the fact that students have to wear school uniform, it might be the idea of a reward system, or it might be the timekeeping or the hierarchical structure of the school itself. All, according to Bowles and Gintis, preparing students for a life within a capitalist workforce. And then you've also got that really important phrase in there as well, myth of meritocracy, obviously directly goes against anything functionalists say about our education system, whereby here Marxists are arguing the working class are sold a dream within education that they can achieve whatever they want to achieve as long as they have the academic ability and they work hard to do that. Whereas actually Bowles and Gintis are arguing here that no matter how hard the working class work, no matter how much natural ability they have, they will never be able to achieve the same as the middle class, because the middle class have that birth privilege and advantage over them. So then in our evaluation, we take the opposite end of the political spectrum, the New Right, who obviously take a much more right-wing perspective on education, here using the examples of marketisation of education and the social policy introduced off the back of that, such as league tables and free schools, which the New Right argue absolutely do make schools fair and do make schools more meritocratic, which matches the demands of a capitalist modern economy. And finally, our conclusion. In conclusion, schools still perform a very important role and function in modern society. Whilst functionalism presents an outdated and overly idealistic view of education, Marx is focused too heavily on the influence of capitalism on education. So we've got a nice simple conclusion here where we summarise the two main perspectives that we have discussed. And we argue that functionalists, they take that rose-tinted view of education like they do the other structures in society. It's an overly idealistic view that education works to serve the whole of society in a positive way. And then we've got the Marxist view, which is too negative about the role and function of education in today's society, viewing it only through the eyes of the bourgeoisie and capitalism, and therefore failing to actually understand that for some working class students, modern education really can have a transformative effect on their lives and their life chances. Methods in context. Read item B and answer the question that follows. Item B. Investigating parental attitudes towards student attainment. Marketisation policy in education, such as the introduction of free schools, has led to some parents having much more involvement in their child's schooling experience. This may mean that parents are more aware of their child's attainment throughout school, and as a consequence, some parents may become more active in helping their child to be successful. Sociologists may research these parental attitudes by carrying out postal questionnaires. This is a highly practical method that would allow the researcher to quickly reach a large number of parents, potentially from a variety of different backgrounds. Applying material from item B and your own knowledge of research methods, evaluate the strengths and limitations of using postal questionnaires to understand parental attitudes towards student attainment. 20 marks. So just a reminder that in general with these 20-mark questions, you should be allocating 30 minutes to read the item, interpret the item, and plan and write your answer. As this is the last question on the paper, it is often one that students find they run out of time on. So just to remind you again, it is your choice which order you answer the questions in on the exam paper. You might decide that as this is a higher tariff question, you want to start with this one and then leave your lower tariff questions to the end. With regards to the structure of this one, you are always going to be asked to take a specific context of education. Here our context is parental attitudes towards student attainment, and to apply that context to a specific research method. Here we have postal questionnaires. And as you can see, the question is asking you to evaluate the use of such a method in such a context. So your essay needs to be focused on the advantages and disadvantages of whichever method you get within whatever context you get. I would always recommend for this type of question trying to focus as much as possible on your PhETs, i.e. practical, ethical and theoretical advantages and disadvantages of the specific research method. So practical advantages and disadvantages within a research context refers to how costly the research will be, how we are going to gain access to our respondents, how time consuming it might be. And ethical considerations includes informed consent, the right for respondents to withdraw at any point in the research, and ensuring that all personal information is kept confidential and private. And finally, theoretical considerations refers to that big debate within sociological research between interpretivists and positivists. So here we are considering terms like validity, reliability, and generalizations. And once we have considered all of our PhET or practical, ethical, and theoretical considerations, the next thing we need to do within this answer is ensure wherever possible we stay within the context that we are given, which once again here is regarding parental attitudes towards student attainment. So the trap that a lot of students fall into, which means they do not get into the top band on this question, is by just giving a very general answer regarding the strengths and limitations of a research method. They don't specifically think about that research method in the context that they are given. And there will always be clues in your item with regards to that context. So if we take item B, for example, if you have a look at the second sentence down there, it says that marketisation has led to some parents having much more involvement in their child's schooling experience. And if we take that sentence and apply it to our research method, postal questionnaires, that may lead us to conclude that actually we might get quite a high response rate from certain types of parents because marketisation policy, which encourages competition in education and parentocracy, literacy, i.e. parents becoming more involved, may lead to parents having more opinions about their child's education and therefore them being more likely to pick up a pen, actually complete that questionnaire and send it back to the researcher. And just with regards to the item, as mentioned, it is a stimulus. It is there to help give you some ideas. So you do want to maybe refer to it 2 or 3 times in your answer if you can, but you must also bring in ideas that are not mentioned in that item. So for example, we know that one of the main advantages of using a research method like questionnaires is they are a highly reliable method according to positivists, and reliability is not mentioned anywhere within that item. So we are going to need to construct a paragraph that refers to that. Ideally, within a 20-mark question like this, you are going to be constructing at least 3 to 4 paragraphs and including a short conclusion at the end where you really do summarise whether this is an appropriate method for the context within education. Also, do feel free to bring across synoptic knowledge from the education topic. You can add the names of sociologists or theorists where appropriate, as long as it fits within the context of education that you have been given. With that in mind then, let's have a look at the mark scheme. So as shown within the 17 to 20 mark level descriptors, we are looking for some of the same things that we are always looking for on a 20 mark answer in sociology, but there are some extra little things we need to apply on this methods in context question. First of all though, knowledge is detailed, conceptual and analytical about postal questionnaires. And conceptual knowledge associated with research methods is always going to include those key terms to do with positivism or interpretivism, such as reliability or validity. And then when it comes to that being analytical within research methods, that is all about making links between these key terms. So for example, a positivist would argue that postal questionnaires are a very good research method because they will provide reliable data. That is because the questions are standardised and the research is therefore repeatable. If research is repeatable and standardised, we can complete it time and time again, and over time we should be able to make generalisations. And that second bullet point is absolutely key to getting top marks on this question. Knowledge will be applied accurately to the specific investigation. So when it comes to parental attitudes, you need to be ensuring we are thinking about how are we going to make contact with parents? Which parents are going to be more likely to reply than others? Is this going to affect the representativeness of our investigation? How are we going to operationalise our questions? There is a lot of jargon or specific terminology within education that parents might not be aware of. Ethically, might this actually make some parents feel a little bit self-conscious about their child's attainment in a way that they've never really thought about before? So it really is just ensuring every point you make, you are able to apply it to that specific context. And then that third bullet point down highlights that we need knowledge of a range of strengths of limitations. So making sure that you are applying at least 3 or 4 different ideas, ideally even more than that within your answer. And then just like you would on any other type of essay, drawing conclusions at any available opportunity. So that might be at the end of your paragraph, or that might be a conclusion at the end of your answer where you do reach a decision on whether this is an appropriate method for the context given. So let's have a look at a model answer. Applying material from item B and your own knowledge of research methods, evaluate the strengths and limitations of using postal questionnaires to understand parental attitudes towards student attainment. 20 marks. Postal questionnaires are a research method associated with positivists who hope to gain a broad and reliable understanding of a research question such as parental attitudes to education. As mentioned in item B, postal questionnaires are a highly practical method to understand parental attitudes towards student attainment because they are quick and relatively cheap to produce. Once the researcher has produced the questionnaire, they can easily post this out to as many households as they wish for the price of a stamp. This is a good way to research attitudes towards student attainment, as it means the researcher will gain a large volume of responses from a variety of different households, which should result in a representative sample of parents. This is important as parents may have different attitudes towards attainment depending on factors such as their age, class or ethnicity. So in our brief introduction, all we need to do is show the examiner that we know it is our more scientific sociologists, i.e. positivists, who favour quantitative research methods such as postal questionnaires because they focus on gaining reliable data, i.e. that means they favour any method where there is a standardised set of questions such as questionnaires, which means we can complete the research again and again and be likely to see similar results. parents. What we then go on to do in our first sentence is refer specifically to the item with a quote, and here we are focusing on practical reasons why questionnaires are a good way to understand parental attitudes towards student attainment. And this is a really good example of a paragraph where you can see how we take the more general advantage of using postal questionnaires, i.e. they are very cheap and quick to produce once you have actually written out your questionnaire, and we apply it to the specific context because we are arguing, well, it's absolutely brilliant that we can send these postal questionnaires out to a variety of different households, which means we are going to hopefully receive a representative sample of parents. And from our studies of education, we know that demographic characteristics such as the ethnicity or the social class of a parent can have a huge impact on that student's attainment. If we didn't include that sentence specifically referring to how this relates well to parents within education, we would absolutely not be able to achieve the top band in this answer. Let's read on now and have a look at some evaluation of that. However, a practical difficulty the researcher may experience is gaining the addresses of parents to understand their views. This is because schools are not permitted to release this information under strict GDPR laws, meaning researchers may have to consider alternative options such as official statistics that do not pose the same access problems. So within our evaluation, we are referring to the fact that whilst it is very cheap to post out lots of questionnaires, it is not going to be easy to access parents. Parents, particularly at secondary school, are not actually in the school building very often. You could even refer to changes that have happened since COVID, whereby parents' evenings in many schools are now also conducted remotely, meaning that actually for some parents, there is never an opportunity to actually access the school building, which means that most researchers are going to have to rely on the head teacher or another gatekeeper within that school handing over details of addresses. However, under General Data Protection Regulation that was brought in 2018, also known as GDPR, schools have to be very strict about who they provide this data to. And actually, that is a fantastic practical disadvantage that you can include in almost any of these methods in context questions. Anytime the research will involve the researcher being given some potentially private and confidential information from the school means that that researcher is very likely going to face problems. And obviously there are ways that we can overcome that. We've suggested here the idea of using secondary sources such as official statistics instead when we are researching education, or it might be that you just have to go through the process of requesting consent from parents in order to access their addresses. And whichever way you go with it doesn't really matter as long as you focus on also putting your evaluation into the context of parental attitudes and gaining access to parents. Let's read on. This may also be a limitation of this type of research method when investigating parental attitudes, as some parents will be much more likely to complete the questionnaires than others. As shown in item B, some parents have much more involvement in their child's schooling than others. Marketisation policies in education have led to middle-class parents taking a much more active interest in their child's education, meaning they may be more likely to reply than working-class parents who may have had a negative experience of education themselves and not want to engage. This would result in responses that do not reflect a representative sample of parents, and therefore the researcher would be unable to make generalisations about parental attitudes towards attainment. And this paragraph here is another great example of how you might use the same idea in several of these methods in context questions, but just make sure you make it specific to the context that you are given. So here we are arguing that those marketisation policies that we have learnt about within the education topic, such as the introduction of league tables or free schools, have led to middle-class parents having more of a say or more involvement in their child's education. And if they have more involvement in their child's education, it's very likely they are going to be more eager to complete a questionnaire regarding that. It might be that they want to show off about how great their engagement is in their child's education, or it might be that they're just more focused on how the research may benefit their child. As opposed to working class parents, which as we've learnt about within the education module, can sometimes be a little bit more reluctant to engage with anyone who appears to be a member of an academic or school type environment based on their own negative experiences of education. Therefore, we can always argue when research involves samples of parents, it is going to be much more likely that middle class parents reply working class parents don't, and therefore we will not be able to gain a representative sample. Do just note when we use the term representative sample, we make a link to show analysis to the examiner that if we do not get a representative sample, then this means we are unable to make generalisations. And as mentioned when we considered the mark scheme, it is very important in a research methods question to show how one concept and idea leads to another. Let's read on. Positivists suggest that an advantage of using self-completion questionnaires is the data obtained will be quantitative and therefore easier to analyse. This would be very beneficial when considering parental attitudes to student attainment, as it means that the researcher will be able to easily display key facts and headline figures relating to how parents feel about their child's education. It may also mean the researcher can compare trends between different social groups, which may help to explain how important external factors like parental involvement in schooling is in understanding educational trends, such as boys' underachievement. However, interpretivists would argue this data may not be valid. Parental attitudes to student attainment is a complex and emotive subject that parents may need time to explain fully, rather than simply ticking a questionnaire box. They would instead advocate for the use of a method such as unstructured interviews, where the researcher can probe to discover more about parental feelings regarding attainment on a deeper level. So within this paragraph, we go back to the idea about positivists favouring this type of research method. But we don't just write a general paragraph about positivism, we make sure that we straight away in our second sentence go into the context of why this would be beneficial when considering parental attitudes, i.e. it means that the researcher is able to compare parental attitudes between different groups of parents. What this paragraph also does really well is then link that further in context by bringing in some of the information and knowledge that we have gained from the education module, i.e. we have learned that working class boys in particular are underperforming in education. So therefore, if we want to understand parental attitudes towards student attainment, it is going to be very likely that the researcher will want to find out about the attainment of working class boys. And through using self-completion questionnaires, we should be able to compare these key facts and headline figures as suggested. We then create debate between our other theoretical perspective, i.e. interpretivists, but again, we don't just give a general argument about why interpretivists would look more to gain qualitative data, we put it in the context of parental attitudes. And this is another sentence or idea that you can apply in lots of these research methods in context questions. And that is that schooling and education, whether it's from a student perspective or a parental perspective, is a very emotive and complex topic. It's something that people might find quite difficult to talk about, particularly if they are underachieving in education. So therefore, interpretivists are always going to put forward that argument that something like an unstructured interview or participant observation is really going to allow an understanding to be gained on a much more sensitive but also deeper level, where the respondent is able to go off on a tangent if they need to, or fully explain their true feelings on this topic. Let's read on. Finally, one could argue this method is ethically very sound when considering parental attitudes to student attainment. This is because the researcher is detached from the postal questionnaire and parents can decide whether they would like to complete research on a personal topic such as their child's attainment in the comfort of their own home. This may make them feel more comfortable, particularly if their child has low attainment and is finding school very difficult. Within this paragraph then, we address some of the ideas that we've just been talking about with regards to students that are actually experiencing difficulty within education. And here we say that actually postal questionnaires could be a really positive experience for parents, because maybe they can sit down in their own time, discuss the questionnaire with the student and decide if they want to complete it or not. Whereas if they were taking part in something like an unstructured interview, they may actually feel there is more pressure to respond even when they don't feel comfortable in doing so. In conclusion, this represents a practical and ethically sound way to research a very important educational issue and may produce a large sample. However, this may be at the cost of gaining deep, valid responses to help us understand how parents truly feel. Therefore, taking a mixed methods approach may address these concerns. So in your conclusion, I would always recommend talking about the greatest advantages that this research method offers in this particular context. However, I would also recommend going with the mixed methods approach at the end, i.e. arguing that overall the best way to investigate such a complex issue as something like parental attitudes is to combine a number of different research methods. There are not going to be many topics that could come up in the exam where that conclusion would not work.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.